So, welcome back. We had a slightly different session, as we said. This was a session where the moderators were from the EU Commission, and they had one very important message, which that group, which the new way of working was experimented, where we were not that good at following that advice. And that advice was that it is very important to listen. Otherwise, it is difficult to comprehend what the others may say. Now we have a task which is very demanding for all of us. 2 minutes each, rapporteurs. And I hope, I wish and trust you that now we'll listen, because these rapporteurs have made a lot of work to condense messages. So it's like I hope, like a poetry. Every sentence has a meaning. And no pressure for rapporteurs, no. So let's listen that carefully, do some conclusions at the end, and then the expert group will continue a closed session. And for rapporteurs, please follow the 2-minute rule, because you are consuming the time from the others. So equal time sharing for each rapporteur. And if I'm kind man, Natalie is not a kind person in these matters, so she will then remind you. Okay, so we start with the yellow A1 in session 1, Trusted AI. The first rapporteur, please.
Okay, so that's me, Fredrik Heinz from Sweden. So, of course, we discussed starting from these bullet points here, but I've kind of written down what we talked about. So AI should be compatible with legal standards that we already have. What applies offline should also apply online. AI is too broad and varied. We need to classify applications and treat them differently. We need to have use cases to do this. Trust is a relation. Trustworthy is therefore more relevant than trusted. If a system can demonstrate positive outcome, people will trust the outcomes, just like we do with people. And here we have an issue that kind of the general trust in society is decreasing, and that makes things a bit more tricky. There is a need to have clear liability and to know the limitations of the systems. There is a responsibility of government to educate their citizens and to understand the technologies themselves. What different approaches we can use is, for example, industry standards with third-party certification, regular checks, continuous inspection of the input and output of systems. Education is essential because trust requires that you understand what the other party is trying to do. We also need to increase trust in society in general, and we can weakening the black box problem to kind of opening up the boxes. Access to data drives AI. Who has access and who controls it? And we also have to keep in mind that not all humans are trustworthy, and what counts as bias is basically a political question which varies over time. AI-specific regulation is premature. We need to look further down the road. We should focus more on principles for now to retain flexibilities for businesses. And we might rather talk about AI as an ecosystem rather than individual or independent systems. And we also have a scarcity of human resources. We are good at writing policies, but not necessarily implementing them. And we are kind of splitting our efforts that someone suggests we should think more like China and act like China, that we need to focus our efforts and make sure that we get something done. And we also have to keep in mind that AI has many good usages. For example, that we actually have the opportunity to start to actively counter bias and to minimize errors in important decision-making processes. Thank you.
I think it was me. So in our group, we reached very similar points as the previous group, so I concur with almost everything that's been said before. And probably just to complement new things that we discussed that maybe weren't mentioned before, a lot of the discussion was on understanding that AI systems are complex. It's about the data you use, the algorithm that you build, how it's being deployed, and how it's being used, and the fact that these systems are alive. They're not static systems, and they're constantly being updated. So how do we include the concept of trust or trustworthiness in all these elements in the chain? We discussed a lot about standards and different bodies of standardization, like the ISO and IEEE standards and so forth. And I think there was a fair amount of agreement on the need for some kind of like a systematic approach on deploying and building and communicating these systems, so trust is sort of like generated, or the systems are worthy of people's trust. Understanding and education was a big point. Another point that was made that maybe wasn't mentioned before was the need for being inclusive to all demographic groups, particularly the elderly or people who have disabilities. It turns out that today, a lot of people with disabilities cannot operate basic appliances, which they could 20 years ago, because I guess they were more mechanic, and now it's like all digital. So how can we make sure that we are inclusive? And then we also discussed, the key are the use cases, which was mentioned before, and we also discussed this tension between developing this trusted AI European way and making it so complicated that at the end we have no European AI companies being developed because of that.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Chiara Giovannini from ANEC. ANEC is the association representing consumers in standardization. I am going to present a little bit the discussion we had on the 4 questions, although we focus on the 2 first questions. And why is that? Because we said that the way to create trust is to show the benefits to society at large. We also started to consider what trust is in the artificial intelligence environment, and we had a very savant definition of willingness to take social risks under choice, with choice. So the concept of choice was quite present in our discussions. Transparency, accountability, I believe it has been mentioned, security, privacy, safety, as well as affordability, access, usability of the applications. Need to have remedies in case something goes wrong, both at the individual and at the public level. Rising awareness, definitely, but we also mention the need not to shift the responsibility, because you know something, it doesn't mean you're going to be responsible of if something goes wrong. So there was really a very balanced approach in our group. Finally, there is going to be trust in the artificial intelligence systems if sustainability in terms of economic, social, and environmental impact is taken into account. We then moved to the tools in order to implement such trust. We need to document this transparency in order to inform, to be transparent. Life cycle management was mentioned as one of the important tools to show transparency. Also inclusive governance systems. And finally, we also mentioned the European touch in terms of diversity of languages, size of companies, but also values. Thank you very much.
We talked about that self-learning algorithms and AI creates this black box in transparency that can impair trust. So we discussed concepts of explainability and also ethics, which are by design encoded into the system to install trust. And this, by design encoding, should be based on very explicit instructions, guidelines, or standards, so that decoders can implement those. With respect to responsibility, we said there's an ethical dimension of responsibility, but also importantly was discussed the legal liability, which is a part of this concept, and also then the accountability. And we said that liability should always remain in humans. So in order to have someone accountable and when it came to the tools, it was said that different tools should be considered and that a mix of tools should be considered. They should be legal and technical. Technical, for example, bias detection, and examples were given for other tools. For example, the problem of deception when humans can't differentiate AI from humans when they interact with them. It should be made clear that AI is engaging with a human. So the second thing was, for example, confidence levels or error rates of artificially intelligent systems should be somehow communicated by the provider of those systems in order to allow clients or consumers to estimate the reliability of the systems. Standards for transparency, explainability, ethics, or biases, whatever, to install trust are a good thing, but when they should somehow be enforced or controlled, and therefore an audit system should be installed to somehow also certify these systems so that the end user knows that the system works according to what was promised. I think my time is over. Right.
Okay, so that's me again. So for this one, we said that one size does not fit all. We need to modulate our expectations depending on what is at stake. And people are interested in transparency and accountability for things that matter. Let's focus our energy on those. When it comes to transparency, data sets must be accessible for challenge. We can have systems that you can use to challenge them. When it comes to processes, it's very important that they are transparent. And they're starting to come these kind of fact sheets related to what different systems and data sets can do, how they have been developed, and so on to increase the trust in them. When it comes to systems, interpretability and explainability is more relevant than transparency. Regarding accountability, it depends on intent. There always will be mistakes, so we have to make sure that companies dare to take risks and learn from incidents, have the society in the loop. We need a systematic dissection of accountability. We mentioned 4 levels: input, throughput, output, and ultimate impact. In the text, there was talk about algorithmic accountability, but it was empty. There's also the concept of hybrid accountability that's relevant. And it's also very important to make it clear, who do I engage with to get help with something? We also talked about ban on social hallucinations, that the human must always know whether they talk to a person or not. But then we also consider that it's actually very hard to determine this. That might even be impossible. And we need to involve the public more, both from education and other aspects. Co-creation was mentioned. It was also mentioned that there is a risk that we introduce too much, what should I say, inconvenience. So we also need to think about the convenience, because that's what consumers normally prioritize. Otherwise, it's risky that they would just not use our systems and use someone else's. To have a meaningful human control, humans need access to more information to make more nuanced decisions compared to the computer. And you will not be able to get that for every decision. Europe needs to take a leadership on AI governance. And again, there is a lot of discussions on the bad aspects of AI, but we should remember that AI can be used for good, and most companies want to do good. Thank you.
Yes, as clearly I had the trust of my second group. I'm again the rapporteur. The concept of transparency was discussed at length, a little bit more than accountability, and it was transparency and different level of transparency. Why is that? Because there are different addresses of this transparency, different levels for different stakeholders. Consumers might need different kind of information than the auditors of the system. Very interesting, we focus almost all of our discussions on the concept of deception-free use of artificial intelligence. What does it mean to be transparent and accountable? Not to deceive the users. For example, by triggering emotional reactions, by mimicking human reactions or human feelings in the machines or by the machines. We recognize there is a application context dependency of accountability and especially transparency use cases. So it complements what will be said later on. And the transparency both of the human-machine interaction, but also about the use of the data. Again, the use of the data, when it comes to personal data, there is the principle of consent, but we quickly realize that there can be a case of consent overload. So we need to have transparency by design in the algorithm. And this is the tools, the practical implementations. We also identify the value impact assessment as a useful tool, like privacy impact assessment, security impact assessment. Need to proceed with a legal gap analysis, what is already there and what we need more. We discuss general data protection regulation. It covers a bit. We need something more. We also identified algorithm to check other algorithm, so to provide proof of trust. And finally, simplification of information, again, in order not to have this consent overload, to provide meaningful choices, but also to have privacy and accountability and security and safety, everything by design as much as possible. Thank you very much.
That's me. Hi. Yeah, so we start the session with the summarized question from Barry. If we want to scale the use of AI in Europe, what kind of thing we can do? There was a lot of discussions from academia, from industry, and from also members who are already engaged in discussions with their member states. But I can summarize, there was 5 main points that we can do. The first one was around focus on the European story. Instead of going and replicating what the Americans or the Chinese do already, we should focus on our strength rather than our weakness. And that's by the ethics is one of it, and using it to enable. So it was missing in the morning section, the link was missing, but we thought that's one of the main enablers of the use of AI that makes for industries easier to make the shift. So that's one. The second element under the European story was focus on industries where we are already leading the markets, and that's healthcare, automotive, aerospace, chemical industries, and also focus on where we should take responsibility as a government, and that's education, energy, healthcare, and fix our responsibilities first. That was said. And that's within the strong story. There was also a discussion around GDPR and education under that same point. The second one was talent. This is by this is not the priorities order, this is just my own order. The talent was the second point on my list, and the discussion points were education, how to shift the education towards more increasing the talent, upskilling teams of people that are already in companies and that were doing different jobs, and they have the knowledge domain, and just train them to shift their expertise towards AI, create different job levels within the data scientist scale, instead of having one big job where you require all the skills from software engineering, from AI, and we have to decompose it to different level where we can use talent. And then we had also a point under the talent is that EU can fund and give incentive for upskilling, for example, with companies to upskill their talents. The third point was investment strategy, and there were a few points here. Where the VC tunnel was one of it. We can invest as European companies, but then with the VC strategy, the exit will be within big companies again, and we didn't do anything. So how to shift the exit strategies towards the European market, and how to not invest in a way that it will go finally to the big companies. The other one is the simulating corporate ventures to take in and to invest in companies. It's too much, maybe. There were two last points, one around the input-output framework, what data should go in and how to access the data, and also to realize that we are using all US frameworks. So before we used also European frameworks, how we can use European frameworks for decision pipelines for such systems. And finally, which is most important, mindset shift, which is within the startups, we see the amount of money invested in companies that's much smaller in Europe, although the frequency is high. Shifting that mindset, creating regulations that will help shift the monopolism towards more collaborating stakeholders in this space. So this, in summary, it's been said a lot of that. So.
Yes, how to accelerate the uptake of AI. Essentially, we have 4 points. The first one is ecosystems. We basically said that Europe should build on top of the existing ecosystems, the ecosystems that Europe is strong at, and we have a very concrete proposal. We said let's use health, automotive, and future factory as 3 domain-driven ecosystems. And when we choose those, let's study all the enablers in one. Meaning data, research, regulation, startups, and all of these enablers that could be thought of. Another proposal was to set up the EU unit, or that could do a kind of 360 approach around those defined ecosystems, and with a very simple question: how can EU help to increase your competitiveness? So that's the first ecosystem. The second was surely research and education. We said Europe should invest and mobilize research and education, link it to industry, and surely scale in talents. We had a very concrete proposal. Let's merge Alice and Claire. Then third, data. We said let's enable administrations to share data. Public data is a new gold for Europe, and we should look into this. We also had a very concrete proposal. We said let's make health data flows across European markets possible. And then lastly, we said no AI is possible without adoption. So here goes consumers, here goes larger society. We need training courses, we need investments into basic skills and specific skills. Without adoption, no uptake is possible.
Hi, it's me again. So in this session, we focused a lot on what would be needed in terms of the infrastructure to enable AI. And we talked about infrastructure, data, and skills. In terms of infrastructure, we talked about computation. We need a lot of computation to train deep learning models, but we also need communication infrastructure across borders. For example, we won't be able to have autonomous vehicles if somehow when you cross a border. Oh.
That's fine. Go ahead.
Oh, I thought you showed the other one. Yeah, we were in this one, no? No. Oh.
So it's not this one.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so should I finish? I guess I was in the next one. Okay, so maybe I'll finish. Sorry. So communication infrastructure, we won't be able to have autonomous vehicles if, when you cross the border, then the vehicle doesn't have the right communication infrastructure. We also talked about the importance of sandbox environments, and they mentioned the example of the Terra Lab in France as a way for small companies and startups to have access to the needed computation and cloud computing resources for cheap. In terms of data, we talked, similarly to other groups, we talked about how there is a lot of publicly available data from administrations, but it's not about the amount of data, it's about the quality of the data and how usable that data is for training machine learning algorithms, for example. So we talked about what incentives could be done or what programs could be done to generate useful data and data that can be used for training systems. In that context, it was also mentioned an example in France for a syndicated platform where different companies share data in this more protected environment. And also about Opal, which is an initiative by Data Pop Alliance to enable third parties to run algorithms on proprietary data. And then another building block was education. And in terms of education, I think it's been covered before. We talked about from basic education for children and adolescents to lifelong education and opportunities of using MOOCs and online systems like the Master in AI developed by the Spanish AI Association, which is online. Another element on the human side is how can we retain the talent. And one proposal was to make it more fluid and easier in Europe for people from industry to go back to academia, because there is a big exodus of academics going to industry right now on AI. And then there is education for the public, and there the biggest comment was the importance to engage with the civic society in a co-creation, kind of like bi-directional way, not just to like dump information into people. We discussed a lot of key areas for Europe, and some of the areas that were identified were education, health, public services, climate change, and tourism. Some of the red line topics that were proposed was facial recognition and autonomous and lethal weapons. And just to wrap up, we discussed smart regulation, and the main idea there was to only regulate when it's needed and for whatever is needed, and exploit existing legal frameworks for most of the deployment of these systems. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so my name is Philip Suzalek from DFKI, also one of the initiators of CLAIRE, which was just mentioned. If you haven't looked at CLAIRE, please do so, and please join if you agree with that. And yes, we have been working very hard on merging or bringing ELIS and CLAIRE together. We haven't been not successful so far, but I hope we will be soon. We've addressed 4 areas in this breakout group, infrastructure and networking. So the main idea here, think big, come up with moonshot projects, also as motivations for young talent to stay here. That needs a large infrastructure, CERN-like infrastructure, multi-tier network of data and computing, also for experimenting. We pointed out that the EuroHPC is building, there's a lot of investment in EuroHPC for building large-scale computing, and that should be have a stronger focus on AI. The next one was the different AI approaches. There's a new wave of data. The world where cyber and physical is growing closer together, not just with IoT, but that's a part of this. And 2 examples we talked about was the digital reality or digital twins. So this idea of modeling the world, simulating it, using that for training and validation of AI. Automotive driving being a key part of that, but also robotics and in other areas. A third area was talent. Talent is probably the most crucial point in European AI. We need the network of the best people and the interaction between them, but also the interaction with the young talent, and that needs an infrastructure to do that. But we shouldn't forget the breadth, in particular things like people like technicians or data engineers or software engineers for AI, which doesn't really exist yet. A key part of that was creating a trademark for European excellent AI made in Europe and for Europe and the rest of the world, of course. And the final point, context, culture of empowerment, the just do it attitude for investment and innovation. And finally, we came up with 2 action points. One was already mentioned in a previous group, to come up with, to focus on ecosystems such as health, automotive mobility, and factory, to kind of really, as an example, as a vertical example, with all of the elements that we need for successful AI in Europe. But also correlate that with their suitable research approaches. Yeah, and the last one is speed is of essence in all of our activities. We need to start quickly. We cannot wait until things filter through governments. And these ecosystems are one way of doing this. We need a grassroots approach, bringing industry with research together, and essentially fund motivation for getting funding quickly, so we can start working on these key elements as soon as possible. Thank you.
Good afternoon, I'm Cristina from Spain. We got 3 messages. Message number 1 was not to reinvent the wheel. Technical guidelines exist already in order to assess whether the artificial intelligence produced has quality or not, as far as the math goes, encompassing data quality, sample bias, or algorithm performance with objective KPIs. The second message is, of course, thresholds for those KPIs should be different by use case according to its sensitiveness. We created 2 tiers of use cases relative to its priority in order to develop guidelines. Priority 1 use cases were anything related to healthcare, anything related to robots that interact with humans, either in a physical form or not, such as assistants, butlers, social robots, industrial robots, etc. The third use case in this priority 1 was human augmentation. And the fourth one, anything related with public sector, government policing, smart cities, or terrorism. Public sector, in a way. And those 4 use cases are the tier 1. In tier 2, we came up with self-driving cars, algorithms that score people, either for insurance purposes, job applications, credit loans, etc., education and exchange markets. That was our second message, the 2 tiering of use cases. And the third message is that we did not reach an agreement relative to the military use case, specifically autonomous weapons. And some of the colleagues in the group were for a specific positioning on this use case in this first guidelines, while some other people in the group were in favor of further consultation with expert domains, specifically on national security, etc.
Thank you very much. My name is Ursula Pahl from BIOC, the European Consumer Organization. In relation to the use case discussion that we had in our group, to summarize, I think one can say that we had 3 threads, but we did not come as far as maybe the previous group to say this is the priority number 1 cases and so on. So I just list, first of all, the type of domains, as we called it, that should be potential, that should give potential use cases. There was quite several points about health data. So that was like collection of patients' data without consent, or health data that are held by governments, and the privacy of health data in general. There was discussion about legal data. That means the use of data for judicial decisions. Identity data in relation to smart borders, risks of discrimination in that field, consumer products and services, so all types of problems in terms of concerns, discrimination, lack of information, safety, etc. Digital advertising, voter manipulation, democracy threat, etc. Automated cars, employment, selection of CVs for interviews, public services, selection for tenders, telecommunications, the use of biometrics to identify yourself to use the appliance. Very interesting about discussion about children sex robots bought by or used for pedophiles, robots for elderly and disabled. So all these type of domains were identified. Secondly, we had some horizontal themes that could also be relevant for use cases. For example, ethical principles of a company, what is the scope and what happens if they are not respected. Moral pressure to share data that can arise, for example, in the health domain, a right not to share the data. The whole concept of consensus of the data subject and how to get meaningful concept, discrimination in all forms, including economic discrimination, and how to deal with contradictory positives. And thirdly, we had quite a discussion about the methodology for use cases. I come to an end. So what to do, what to use the cases for, risk-benefit analysis, look into questions that go beyond maybe the guidance by the ethics criteria, and how to differentiate between selecting high-risk cases or normal risk cases, and what is this checklist that we want to use for going through these use cases. So these were the questions that we raised. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all for very rich contribution, which will be then fed in to the coming texts and the elaboration, how we will take the form of writing and reporting, and also classifying the actions forwards. And special thanks for rapporteurs for these concise summaries. Let's one plea from Natalie's side, rapporteurs, if you could please send your reports to Natalie, and also be available if there are clarifying questions or questions where some background information would be needed for making sure that we are capturing the important ideas for future use. How to make a conclusion out of this? Let me try and do it in a bit provocative way, and the provocation comes in the form of action, because if we think there are 4 elements we are struggling with. We are struggling with the general and use case, and we know that it's a use case specific. We should have impact, do something which will show what AI and the actions can deliver. Speed is of the essence, and this is very complex. In many work streams or sessions, actually, it was mentioned that we should experiment. So, the proposal of the question to you, would it make sense to start already next week, Monday, Tuesday, a few programs with the help of this team and the others, and we need to then see who would we get to support that one. A program or programs or streams where we would have 3 or 4 ecosystems, domain-specific ecosystems like healthcare, automotive/mobility, manufacturing, and public to citizen services, and then pull together what does it take to support these ecosystems from the enablers perspective, be they regulatory, be they research, be they investment, be they skills, be they data, but also include the ethics in that particular domain. And seek the cooperation with the key industry players in that particular domain, and in that way get our feet wet. What does it mean? What are the real, concrete, and most important questions we need to tackle, and in which kind of a sequence to get rolling? In that sense, it's provocative. We have not even close to finish what we are about to write, but there is a reasoning saying that in order to know what to write, it wouldn't harm if we would understand how in real life all these things come together, and how we could then have a meaningful list of actions where we would know a bit better, and already in good cooperation with the industries, come up with proposals where we could get the industries aligning. And then, of course, the alignment goes to the member state level, but let's leave that for the time being. So the question is, would that resonate? Would that make sense? Would we learn from that? Would it speed it up? Would it accelerate our learning? What is crucial and important? So, open question on that. Then if you would agree, we need volunteers to join the bandwagon in those things, but that we can handle then later. And then open floor for any other questions you would have before we close and start another session with the members only. Floor is open, please.
I think it's the only way forward, actually, to engage directly in the use cases and see how the different principles and suggestions on even on policy or cleaning up policy actually works in real life. And as I see it, even though this group is super big and that it makes it even more complex, we actually have the right representative here already. We have medical companies, we have tech companies, we have manufacturing companies here. So maybe we should look first, what are we actually missing of stakeholders, if we are missing someone, and then really try to engage some groups around the different sectors or areas that you just proposed.
I would be volunteering on behalf of our country, Finland, to lead the healthcare track. We can put that together with anybody who's volunteering for that.
Can you please repeat and summarize the proposal and the different sectors, please?
So the idea which came in number of workshops was to pick the most important industries where we could actually gain from the impact within these industries the most, probably in the first stage. And they were healthcare, automotive / mobility within automotive, manufacturing, and then public services or public to citizen services. Those were the ones which I heard being proposed, at least in those discussions, which I was part of and which was taken up here. There was, please, and then...
So Michael May from Siemens. Don't know if I got your proposal right, but I think such a thing is currently under implementation. I mean, the European Commission has selected the AI for You AI platform on demand, where there are 80 partners, many in this room, which want to start implementing something along this line, give or take a few use cases, maybe. So maybe that could be speed up, but if I understood you correctly, it's somehow there. It's
not there yet. Excuse me, I don't think we are doing any of that. We have, the European Commission is not doing that.
Yeah, I don't think that the AI platform, there will be some, it's a different thing. So I think it's also a much more complex thing. It's 80 partners, it's a 3 years time. I think that your proposal, if I understand it correctly, is to do some very short proof of concepts, just go and try with a small group looking, and there I think that yeah. I think it's a very important thing to do in order to really get a feeling of what we are talking about, because otherwise we keep kind of repeating, and this you saw already today a bit in the groups that at a certain moment the tendency is to go a bit around and keep repeating the same thing. So I think that's very important to start with very short term, very focused. Doesn't have to be a complex thing, doesn't have to be to include everybody, but just to get feeling within the group what we mean by what we are proposing to do. And I would volunteer to participate.
Thank you. I think this was also discussed in the last group. I think creating those small ecosystems that represent in healthcare, automotive, and the industries that we're interested in are important. But I think there is a step that we do need to do beforehand, and that's looking into the definition of the AI that we achieved the last workshop. We realized that there are a few systems. There is the machine learning systems, there is the machine reasoning systems, there is the autonomous systems. Every one of those systems, we have in the state of the art clear guidelines on how those should be implemented. So starting from that, for example, for machine learning, we have criteria like AOC, under the curve, we have false positives, true positive thresholds. So if we specify those and how important is those parameters, then we can, within the different stakeholder groups, be very specific into what is the price or the cost for every error, what is the importance of every KPI. So I think this is the way to go, especially that for every, now AI is moving fast, and for every new application we're combining a number of tools together. And just giving a baseline and then digging into the application further, I think that will be helpful. And I'm happy to volunteer for the healthcare application of AI.
Yes, I'm also happy to volunteer. We have some case material, so that could be a starter as well for the cases. And healthcare would be a very good one.
What would be the objective of...
What would be the objective or the key things that each of those trials, meaning in principle, I think it sounds like a very practical idea to move forward. I think they need, those trials need some level of KPI, like we were talking about, or objective, to kind of frame what they're trying to achieve. I mean, I'm very happy to support some of those, but I think we need to be crisp on the objectives.
Can I ask you another favor? And the favor is that now if we want to move fast, we actually need to do it quick and dirty. Means that no, we are not going to put the objectives there out, we go and learn. And that's a very different approach. So if we start to define all those matters, we are not moving fast enough, sorry to say. And that means that we need to tolerate the ambiguity. We need to go and learn, and from there we might be, and we should be richer to then answer exactly these very legitimate questions, what we need to do. But that would be a learning journey for us, and just coping with the ambiguity would be the challenge. Otherwise we wouldn't listen, and we wouldn't understand those things in probably in the most profound way, how we could do it. And it's a lot to ask, I know, but that would be my proposal. Going fast, learning, we probably will not have any actions yet with those, but that would be to really see what is important and how these things come together, because at the end of the day, it's a one complex entity what we need to take care of, and single matters, when we look from the top down, are not necessarily seen in the right perspective without going into the use cases. So that was my initial idea, and I don't know whether how that is then reflected. But one word here, one over there.
All right, so you mentioned that you need to get our feet wet, right? And I think from the group you had healthcare, autonomous drive and connected car, and there was, sorry? Public sector, right. So this is just like saying I'm going to pick up randomly something in 3 different areas, but behind this, we are actually have a combinatorial possibilities of use cases. So if you say that you want to start, without any specific objectives, is like doing all over again the Lightyear report that actually killed AI 40 years back. Instead of actually giving a certain use case a target, or you want to build a whole block or building blocks, if we are so generic, if we don't need to work a bit on what do we select, we'll fail. If you want to create a common skeleton or what have you that helps this committee, European Union, what have you, to drive policies forward, if you take public sector, what are you going to take in public sector? We've been down this path for the past 6 months with different governments, okay? And it's complicated. Because if I tell you autonomous drive or connected car, I can write now about 40 use cases on how to do things. The same thing is valid for healthcare. And healthcare is a very slow burner. You need to understand exactly what you're going to do. So if you give us a whiteboard, you'll be amazed that we'll go nowhere. Even if we need to learn fast. I've been down this path for the past 10 years about 8 times. And we failed 7. Right? So now I'm in my 8th reincarnation. So unless you have some specific guidelines about what I need to deliver, we'll fail. And also, I think it was, how long did it take to find the use cases? An hour. That's not proper. In an hour to pull down the 3 and say we're going to go with the 3, I discussed this with Barry in the previous one, and we need to use this platform that it is already online to downstream the 3 up to, one very small use case. Double click on those and find something that has a deliverable, because otherwise, honestly, we'll fail. And we'll fail badly. If you give us a whiteboard, what will come at the end is some policies that will not be down to earth to help everybody. We are going to be very high level, and that's not good. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, Yomi Otsupush BMW. I would be for the public policy as a use case to really start with, because from the automotive side, we see a lot of conflicting legislation. So I think it could help the Commission really to use artificial intelligence to support its better regulation initiative, and you could start that next week.
I'll not ask about the objective because you don't want that, but I would like to ask about the relationship of this ecosystem use case in relation to the other deliverables of this group, because we don't have agreement on the ethic guidance, on the elements on it. We don't have the agreement on the elements of the recommendations for the policy and strategy. So I'm actually worried, though I think it's a good idea in principle, that with the selection, which is very quickly done, and not, sorry to say, but obviously we haven't really analyzed what we want to achieve with that selection, that there may be some things that are not getting the attention that they would need, so that we only focus then on these cases that are, or these questions raised by these cases. Thank you.
I think I have a solution in between. I think if we have a group more application agnostic, not within the specific healthcare applications or automotive. And this application agnostic group looking into the artificial intelligence as a theory, working more on the tech or the academia side, and setting the requirements for each, the ones that we specified in previous meeting. And then once we have, that should be can be translated to any domain basically, and then we take only the use cases that are priority for Europe as a use cases for testing. So instead of so yeah, just agreeing basically on the priority, what is the priority, but having that first group setting the requirements for the different systems, rule-based, autonomous, machine reasoning. That's one proposition.
So, looking at the objective, so I would say that there's 2 parts in what when you have to figure out how things are. The first is to figure out what is important, and the next thing is to do what is important. And very often on the first layer, you cannot really define what is your goal. So this is an empty table, and you have to figure out how to do it. So that's real research, that's open. I like it, that kind of a thing. Starting putting results what you want beforehand when you have got them. It doesn't, in that phase, does not work. When you know what you should do, when you understand the problem, then you put objectives and then you play the game, and that's so. That's difference between R&D. I have done both. What I think about this selection of topics, so they are the ones that the industry kind of or European economy is currently needing. They are extremely important to get them right. But of course, one has to ask the question about whether in 5 years AI has changed the game, so there is a totally different set of industries that actually we play on. So we should also look at that kind of topic. So what is the thing that are creating disruption outside of our current industry basis? But
so if I understand, the idea is to have example and cases from different sectors that could further feed our discussions in the future. My only concern or my recommendation for the possible volunteers for this group is that to look at not only the industrial processes cases, but also about how and who is implementing the processes and the stakeholders there. And as a trade unionist, I would say that we represent people from all these sectors, and they are the idea that the users, when they are workers, or subject to AI when they are implementing or part of a process or a chain which implies AI is very important. So if you can look at concrete cases linked to working life, a working environment in the 3 or 4 sectors, it would be very important to define as well these transversal criteria to assess possible cases.
So just trying to highlight where I think that communication might go wrong. So there has been a workshop also before this, and I believe that there is maybe differences in opinion on what has been defined and what has not been defined. I believe that last time, or at least for this one, we had a set of principles, might not be 100% agreed yet, but we have a list of principles on ethical principles. We do have something, some kind of at least opinion on what does robustness mean, mostly on a technical level for how applications are built. We have some kind of agreement that we should not invent new legislation. We should review the current legislation on how it actually applies on different use cases or scenarios, even make less legislation or make it even more concrete if that is needed. So I believe that we have some kind of framework and agreement around these kind of concepts. And the use cases could be used to actually try that off, saying, okay, it's not finished, it's kind of a trial and error still. But when we actually say robust in this case, what comes out? What happens really? What is the scenario, and how does existing legislation actually apply to this use case? How does the robustness of this data set of this application actually come into life, real life here? And what are the obstacles or problems arising, or even opportunities arising that we want to achieve that we cannot right now? So I think it's a very good way of actually approaching it. Whether it's 100% perfect now, I think it needs some preparation to really kind of look how we apply some modeling on how to work with the use cases. It's still not done. So Monday might be a bit ambitious, but maybe for the next time that we really build those use cases and try to apply the things that we have been discussing in the current on the 2 last workshops.
Okay, there's one more. So we
very quickly from my side, I think this is exactly the approach that we need right now. Not keep discussing things forever. Just get started. Yes, we might do errors in the process, but let's correct them quickly. And I think I can speak for Claire. We are 100% behind that approach. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, very important comments, adding to the way of potentially going with these, I would say, pilots. Just getting pilots, they will not be perfect. These are not by no means the only ecosystems, but we need to start from somewhere, and these are quite obvious ones. And my concern is that how do we make sure that our discussion is that we are really adding value, and we as a group collectively start to understand and appreciate different aspects where we are not experts, but which are important to see the total picture, because it's a very complex phenomenon which we are now dealing with, and therefore getting concrete is not the only, but it's one additional element to the work what we do. So this proposal doesn't mean that this will take our time. We have one work group which is having the AI definition underway. This could be another special group looking these different use cases, and then we'll see what we will learn from there. With that, if there are no other burning open questions, I would like to thank you all for one more time, and the high-level expert group or the members, let's have a 5-minute break and reconvene here. Thank you.